Welcome to this chess video. This game definitely reminds me of Horowitz saying that one bad move nullifies 40 good ones. For those who don't know, the average chess game is 40 moves, and although most games are decided by more than just one blunder, this was definitely a painful loss, but let's take a look at it and actually make it instructional. Sometimes a little bit of humbling moments like this can be good for you, and we can still learn a lot from this game. So my opponent started with e4, I played the Caro-Kann, which is c6, they played f4, and then I of course take the center. Now already I want to talk about the f4 move a little bit, because this is immediately weakening. Now of course it's a book move, and it's, theoretically playable from that standpoint. Kind of looking like a king's gambit, but honestly I kind of have my doubts about this move long term. Especially if you're playing longer time controls. Now granted this is only a 10-minute online game, but whenever this pawn advances, they are now much weaker on their king. For example, this diagonal is weak, but also so is this one, because this pawn would much rather be here. And because this pawn is advanced not one square, but two, that means that this diagonal is also weaker, and even a little bit this diagonal as well. Now if you don't recognize why those squares and those diagonals are weaker, you can take a look at this chess video here that I'll link in the video description. But essentially it's because this pawn and its neighboring pawns can no longer control a lot of those squares. But okay, let's continue. So here, they'll play e5, and I've gotten this position several times before. In the past, I was kind of split between developing his bishop to f5, or simply playing pawn c5. When I studied this, the engine said that both of those were a smidge better for black, but more or less equal. The one that I play nowadays is pawn c5, so that's what I played. And if white delays playing d4 too much longer, then this clamp might actually be really important, especially if I get knight c6, and I'm really deterring them from playing d5, kind of exploiting the fact that they would much rather have the d pawn on d4 rather than this f pawn here on f4. They play knight f3, I develop a knight c6. d4 is still playable, but it is a little bit harder to get in because of the extra support that I have. They played pawn c3, probably trying to reinforce the idea of playing the pawn to d4. But now this of course takes away the square from the knight, and if they're not careful they can definitely fall behind in development. I played bishop to f5, they develop a piece, and now I immediately put the question to this bishop by playing queen to b6. And so they decided to capture my knight, I capture with the pawn, simply trying to reinforce my center even more, and not worried about the fact that these pawns are doubled. Definitely very happy here that my opponent has voluntarily given up the bishop pair. And so if we take a look, both of us have a dark squared bishop, and so that means that long term, because they are missing a light squared bishop, I am completely dominant on the light squares, especially because this bishop is really well placed. Now keep this in mind because the light squares are about to become weak and attacked very soon. Here's a rare case where castling is a mistake. They probably had to play d4, which they've been delaying way too long, and definitely should have taken the chance to do so now. But now I really like the idea that I played here. So my idea was to just play pawn c4, and then later play bishop to d3. If we look at the engine move, one move back, the engine says you can play bishop d3 right away, and that's even better than playing the pawn. But back with what I have here, of course we're trying to anchor that piece on d3. They move their king, because of course that was a check that they had to get out of. And now I anchor my very strong bishop here. And now here's a really instructional moment for the game, where we can see just how massively behind in development white is, and how difficult it is for them to get their pieces out. This rook is trapped, this knight really can't develop too easily, and this bishop is definitely entombed here. So that's like half of white's army just completely immobilized. And what does it cost me? Just one piece. And also the pawn that's even securing it more, but really this bishop is just a monster that is controlling all of those squares. And I actually got this idea of putting a piece in front of a pawn like that from Alpha Zero. I even made a YouTube video on that a long time ago, so I'll leave that in the video description as well. But the game is still early and we're only slightly better, so my opponent plays rook to e1, save their attack piece. And now I have to figure out how I want to continue developing. Of course my advantage is that white will have trouble developing, so that means that I have to accentuate that by trying to develop myself. Of course if I do not develop my pieces, there isn't really much of an advantage there. And so the main priority in this game is to just continue developing while white is just completely tied down with a lot of trouble trying to develop their pieces off the back rank. I chose knight to h6, which I really like, because usually that is not such a good move, because bishop captures here, doubles my pawns, and my knight is not that great. But as you can see, they have these pawns in the way, and so this move is fairly safe. Now my idea with this developing move is trying to get my knight anchored on f5, very common pattern in the Caro-Kann. And I could have brought the knight out this way after moving my pawn, but then it's also blocking in my bishop. And so that's why I chose to develop to the edge of the board. They played their knight to the center on d4, obviously anticipating my knight move and trying to prevent it. But that's okay, I can just play pawn to e6, now trying to get the bishop out. They played queen to f3, and I just continue piece development. Now, it's already kind of difficult to try and find moves for white. It looks like their pieces have kind of come out, except for the queen side that is massively behind and has a lot of trouble trying to get into the game. They played b4 to try and gain space on that side of the board, and I just attack this pawn right away with a5. If they capture, that just helps my rook get into the game, and my queen really has good control in the b file, which also stops them from developing the bishop to b2. If they instead push their pawn to b5, I can just push my pawn past, kicking their knight, and then I'll probably win this pawn. And so their attempt to try and hold this was to play bishop to a3. I decide to capture, and here my opponent just decided to simply drop back. Take a look at a variation to show what happens if they capture instead. I would capture their bishop, they can capture back, but then that would lose the defense of this, and then I'm of course attacking the rook in the corner. So continuing with the game, after they drop back, I really don't want to take here, because then that would help them develop, and that's the whole point of them being trapped there. I want to make it really difficult for them to bring their pieces out. And so instead I keep the initiative going with pawn c5, kicking their knight. Their knight has to come back. And with a position like this, it's really hard to think, how could I have lost this game? Yeah, I wasn't too thrilled with that at all, but at least for the time being, black is much better here. Now, once again, I don't want to take here, and I don't necessarily want them to take either, because if I give them the chance of taking, that helps them open up the bishop diagonal a little bit more. And so to keep them restricted the most, I'll just simply push my pawn past. It looks like I'm keeping the position closed. This is not going to be a closed blockade where somehow white can hold. They play a3, and then I chose to castle. Now going back to before a3, I just want to show real briefly, if they had captured here, I intended to take the rook, they can capture back. Queen captures b3, and notice this knight is still really restricted. And so there doesn't really look like a good way to save them from losing it, because I'm actually attacking it twice. And the engine move is actually just move back, I capture here, and then they just have to capture this bishop that is just way too strong. Even if they lose material, just get rid of that piece that's really a thorn in their side. But okay, returning to the game after castling, now they go knight to c1, with of course the exact same idea. Let's just take this piece that is just really strong. Now, I don't want to lose my bishop that easily. I like having the bishop pair, and especially that bishop anchored there. So I chose to move the bishop back, attacking their queen, and I really considered that they would probably play the exchange sacrifice. My bishop really is that strong, keeping them from developing the rest of their army. But instead, they brought their queen back, and then I decided bishop to c2, which probably would have even been better before kicking their queen, and then not even allow them the chance of the exchange sacrifice with the rook. But what's done is done, and we have a pretty good position. They play d3, sort of kind of trying to trap my bishop maybe, or at the very least get this pawn out of the way, maybe capture, make some room for this knight to try and get into the game. But I'll capture, they'll take here, I've gotten rid of my doubled pawn, and then I can just push to c4. They move their knight, and now even better than f5, I really like this g4 square. Now they played rook to e2, and there's many ways to continue the attack. The way that I found was simply capture their knight, they take back, and then I play this to actually win material. They counterattack my knight. Of course I'll capture here, keeping the attack on their queen. They capture back, and then knight f2 check. They probably don't want to walk into a discovered attack, so they go to h2. But now I relocate, and now my knight is really well outposted. They try and continue developing, then try and get the rook into the game. Looks like they're finally starting to untangle. But now I thought this was the perfect situation to simplify. And although I could capture here, that's only trading knights, and minor pieces are okay, but I think it's better to actually trade the queen. I can easily go into an endgame where I'm up material, and there isn't really that good of a way to avoid this. So they do capture, I take back, they play a4, and now I'll relocate to an even better outpost. Now attacking this bishop, and giving them more things to worry about. They push b5, trying to get those pawns rolling, which is really their only hope. I'll capture the bishop. They play b6, I just have to be a little bit careful. I'm up by 6 points. I should be easily able to convert from here. I bring a rook here to south the pawn, just in case. But yes, indeed, I did lose this game. So again, you really can never count the opponent out. They played a5. I try and get my pawns rolling. They go here. I play d3, which is still winning. They attack my rook. And I do find the strongest move, which is just d2. I'm up by 6 points of material. I don't mind if they take the rook, it's only an exchange, because I'll get their knight in the process, and I'll still be up by 4 points. Plus, my pawns are very dangerous, and all they have is a rook, so they'll probably have to lose their rook the same way that I lose mine. They capture here, and so I continue with my plan, and I captured this knight. And now we're not quite 40 moves into the game, this is move 36, but as you can see by the huge jump in evaluation bar and the orange mistake icon, I have now blown my entire advantage of this game, and now it is about equal. In fact, white is slightly better. Now, of course, what I should have done is simply promote. And then, of course, they'll take. I take their rook. And even if they push their pawn, I'm so close to promoting that I just move a little bit, and I am just in time to stop their queen. If they do promote, of course I can just capture, and my new queen will capture theirs. But unfortunately, after my capture, they now have pawn b7, and I have a lot of trouble already. But I went rook b8, and I'm losing immediately. They play a6. I see what's coming, but I try and promote. They capture, I take back, and now pawn a7. And I don't want to capture here, because of course this will be checkmate. I'd have to block with my rook, and then I got back rank problems. So I have to go all the way back to f8. They'll promote, and now everything is losing, but my best hope is to push the pawn, and hopefully they overlook it. But they're not going to this game. They'll sacrifice here, promote with check, my king comes up, they stop me from going to the center, and I'll breeze through the moves because there isn't a ton left. You can clearly see that white is much better. They stop my pawns, I try and bring my king back to the center, not wanting to step my king here because then they would take with check and then grab this pawn. I push there, try and trade off pawns if possible. We continue really quickly, and the game continues. Again, I'm just kind of shuffling back and forth, trying to set up some stalemate ideas. But none of that is going to work this time, and they checkmate me. So what can we learn from this game? Because we were winning definitely most of the way there, but you can't just write this off as, oh, he blundered on one move. First critical mistake here, which is of course me capturing their knight. Now I only took 6 seconds on this move, which granted is not instant, but considering that I have over 4 minutes on my clock and we're definitely in the endgame, one mistake that you could say is the fact that I didn't give this move more thought. I definitely calculated a little bit, but I obviously miscalculated and should have taken my time a little bit more. If you have enough time, why not be a little extra safe? And so although the computer won't tell you you took too long to think on a certain move, or you didn't take enough time on a certain move, I think in this position, it's a good example of a case where I should have been thinking a little bit more. Even if I were to burn a minute of my clock calculating all the variations, I would still have 3 minutes left, and in a 10-minute game, that's over a quarter of my entire game clock left. But what other mistakes did we have here? I'm over here grabbing the knight, why? Because psychologically, they have just captured my rook. And very often you'll want to recapture things. But what's better, grabbing a knight or promoting and then they have to sacrifice their rook? It seems that if I were to give this a little bit more thought, I would realize promoting to a queen is much more valuable. And even if they capture it, I'm getting a rook, not a knight. So I think the mistake here is thinking that a recapture is forced. I know this might sound simple, that might sound more like a psychology or mindset thing, but I think very often people miss in-between moves because they're assuming a recapture. Now in this case it wasn't really an in-between move, but perhaps if I had assumed the recapture less in my mind, I might have been able to find the winning moves and finished off the game that I was much better in. But instead, things fell apart and I eventually lost, as you know. After I captured here, they play b7, and yes, I am behind, but again, being very scared of the pawns, I block immediately in front, which is definitely not the best move, because this just simply walks into this pawn, and then when it gets here, it kicks my rook with tempo. So really, I should just move the rook much further away, and at least I'm saving that one move, which might be the winning move, considering that all of these pawns are somewhat close to promoting. I think there were mindset errors here just as much as there was objective. Now, if we go back to the middle game, this is move 23, and this is where I've of course captured the knight, removing the defender, and then win even more material. If we look at the engine evaluation here, it says that we are -5. Black is just crushing despite the fact they're only up 1 point of material, because white is so underdeveloped here. And so how do you go from that completely winning position of -5 to this position here being checkmated? Of course, that would tilt most players, but the thing is, I am not most players. And this might sound like a harsh lesson, but everyone has to learn this. Because quite frankly, it doesn't matter how much you are winning. What matters is what position you're in for that moment. Not how you got there, not the mindset of everything that went on before, but only that position. Now this was actually kind of a critical moment because in that one sitting, I ended up playing 13 games in a row. And yes, they were all 10-minute rapids, we're not playing blitz. It was a late night grind. I could make excuses and say, oh, I was just tired and that's why I played poorly. But honestly, my form was alright, I just missed a little bit at the end there. But the difference is I'm able to sit through it, stick by, and just recover. Because sometimes when you lose a bunch like that, it's a really good opportunity to gain against your opponents. Everyone else who tilts off all of their rating. Meanwhile, when the going gets tough, you're just simply getting stronger. Now, by all means, if you're tilted, that's a really good opportunity to just pause for the night, cut your losses, and move on. But if you feel that you're in good form like I felt, then of course you have to keep playing. Because just like how me winning earlier in the game does not matter at all when I have this position being checkmated, the same thing goes for the fact that it doesn't matter how good or how badly I did in the games prior. What matters is the game coming up and the games further into that session. Now I realize that I kind of turned this chess game into a little bit more of a psychology thing, but definitely check out my videos on tilt or anything else to help you get better at your chess. Thanks for stopping by everyone, I'll see you in the next chess video.